Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today for a rock jumper virtual safari to one of Africa's most notable countries, Zambia. If you are new to our webinars, my name is Nikki, together with Keith from Rock Jumper Birding Tours management team, and we are honored to moderate today's webinar. At the bottom of your screen is a Q&A box. Please feel free to send us your questions because we will have time at the end of this virtual tour to answer as many as we can. Long overlooked in favor of more established safari destinations like South Africa and Tanzania, Zambia remains one of Africa's unsung treasures. It's bound to become one of the continent's shining stars, with national parks teeming with big game and birds. Our rock jumper tour leader taking us today on our adventure is Dr. Daniel Danckwerts. Daniel grew up in southern Zambia and has a PhD in zoology, so we know we are in expert hands today. Daniel has been described by a past guest as a delight. We very much enjoyed being with him. His bird skills are excellent and he does a great job getting people on the bird. He was consistently pleasant, polite, and upbeat. A highlight of the trip was the visit to his family farm and meeting his family. From the Rock Jumper management team, we would like to thank you, Daniel, for your incredible enthusiasm, energy, and the pleasure that you take in sharing your knowledge of the birds and relating to all age groups. Your persistence when it comes to birding and finding the target has attained industry best reviews. Daniel, take us to Zambia. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nikki and Keith, and welcome everyone. I'm really happy and really thrilled for this opportunity to tell you about a place that's incredibly close to home. And as Nikki mentioned, Zambia for me is home. The birds that I'll be introducing you today are the birds that I grew up seeing on a daily basis on my family farm, and it gives me immense pleasure to take you on this virtual tour of Zambia. Now, to just begin the presentation, I'm going to tell you a little story about a man that you may or may not have heard of by the name of Dr. David Livingstone. Now, countless stories and books have been written about the explorations of Dr. David Livingstone, but it was his historic journey through the Anglo-Zambezian region between the years of 1858 and 1864 that he is now so very famous for. His ventures into these deepest, darkest parts of Africa were mostly of a missionary nature, specifically in that he hoped to free the natives from slavery, as well as to find the source of the River Nile. Obviously, he was looking in the wrong place. But his most famous discovery came at the sound of an incredibly distant and persistent roar that shook fear into his party. Now, the locals they spoke to in the villages in the area referred to it as the Mozi or Tunya, and they spoke of a river god, the Nyami Nyami, which commanded this region. It was finally on November 16th, 1855, that he finally plucked up the courage to approach said river god, and what he saw he described as the absolute most beautiful thing he had seen anywhere on his travels through Africa. It was, of course, the mighty Victoria Falls. Now, Livingstone approached the river god following the northern bank of the mighty Zambezi River using wooden canoes, and he landed upon Livingstone Island, which is right in this very center of the falls, behind the rainbow that you can see in this image. And from there, he peered down the 108-meter fissure into the boiling pot below the Victoria Falls. Spanning 5,500 feet or 1,700 meters, well more than a kilometer, Victoria Falls was unlike anything he had seen before, and its roar proved deafening, while the immense volume of water flowing over its lip, even during the dry season, cast a cloud of mist several kilometers high into the sky. Now, today we of course know that the river god that the locals told David Livingstone about was just a waterfall, but its grandeur is such that this mighty falls has been recognized as one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. Now, how incredible is that? And this falls is perhaps the primary reason why most people visit either Zambia or the neighboring country of Zimbabwe. However, tonight, in tonight's presentation, I intend to tell you of some of the other riches that Zambia boasts and why this absolutely incredible country is Africa's very best kept secret, and why this incredible country should be your next safari destination. Now, Zambia is located in central southern Africa, smack bang in what scientists refer to as the Anglo-Zambezian region. And this will make a little bit more sense in a few moments' time. It's a fairly large country, several hundred kilometers wide and several hundred kilometers tall, and it's governed by the largest city in the country, and that's Lusaka, which is centrally located. But the falls for which Zambia is perhaps best known are situated in the very south of the country, right on the border of Zimbabwe, and starting place for all of our tours to the country is in the town right besides the falls, named after Dr. David Livingstone, and of course that is Livingstone. This isn't to be confused with the town of Victoria Falls, which is located immediately opposite Livingstone on the other side of the Zambezi River. And as much as the Zimbabweans may try and convince you otherwise, I'm going to be the very first person to tell you that Zambia is the very best place to see the falls. Now, Livingstone never actually found the source of the Nile, that great task that he set himself on his first journey into Africa. And if he had maybe found the source of the mighty Zambezi River, maybe he would have given up a little bit sooner, in that the source of the mighty Zambezi River, which also in fact begins in Zambia near the little blue circle that you can see on my side, is simply a mere puddle in a small patch of forest on the Zambian border between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Angola. Very crudely, the river then flows out of Zambia and into neighboring Angola before finally re-entering Zambia, flowing along the border between Zambia and Zimbabwe for several hundred kilometers, and finally exiting through Mozambique before eventually flowing into the Indian Ocean. You might, however, find yourself asking, how is all of this relevant to our greater story? Well, virtually everything to do with Zambia, its history, its economy, its birds, and its wildlife have something to do with the Zambezi River, and hence the name that I referred to a few moments back, the Anglo-Zambezian region. It's an area that's so very unique at the very edge of the African Rift Valley system that it's recently been recognized as its own biogeographic region. So like Livingstone's historic journey into deepest, darkest Africa, where for much of his journey he used the Zambezi River as his guide, tonight we're going to be following a very similar path, remembering that everything I'm about to show you is somehow related to this incredible river. But just before we get into Zambia's birds and its wildlife, I have to just share that Zambia is one of the absolute friendliest countries in all of Africa. There's virtually no crime whatsoever. The culture is very rich and it's truly African. And the country has an incredibly long and detailed history, and this has been perfectly integrated into its modern infrastructure. But the country does remain quite impoverished and underdeveloped, but this in itself bodes towards its riches. Many areas are completely untouched, with vast expanses of totally virgin forest and a plethora of absolutely fascinating and unique creatures. The forest seen in this image, for example, which is one of the sites we visit on our tours, is the very site where a brand new species of sunbird has recently been discovered. Now, Zambia also offers one of the most authentic African safari experiences, as Nikki said right in the beginning. and the country hosts significant concentrations of many rare and extremely endangered birds and mammals, as well as some of the most beautiful scenery you will see anywhere in Africa. This photo, taken at another one of the lodges that we visit on our tour, is one of the prime destinations, the bird watching destinations that is, in all of Zambia. But the scenery is just more than spectacular there. This view that you see in this picture is in fact the view from all of the rooms that we stay at. So I mean, one simply needs to walk out the front door and you have the most incredible vistas in front of you. Another photo taken at the very same site, you might recognize that caterpillar-shaped mountain in the distance, shows a pair of roan antelopes grazing in a vast meadow. Now, this is one of Africa's rarest and most endangered antelopes. But the kicker here is that these are totally free roaming, some of the very last free roaming populations of these animals anywhere in the world. The same site also hosts totally wild populations of leopard, spotted hyena, sable antelope, and the very rare Central African form of eland, which coincidentally is named after David Livingstone, and that is the Livingstone's eland. Now, many of the game reserves that we visit on our tours in Zambia are totally unfenced, meaning that these areas are more game concentration areas rather than formal nature reserves, as you see in other places, such as South Africa. But these areas do benefit from many of the same levels of protection. And if you still don't believe me that Zambia is just the most incredible place, this photo of a completely wild African elephant taken by a close friend of mine in Zambia was taken just on the outskirts of the town of Livingstone. And in fact, elephants and other wildlife, sometimes including lion, regularly just wander through the town itself. And a quick story from my last trip to Zambia that I guided there earlier last year. We began the tour at a lodge just outside of the town of Livingstone, and for the very first evening, we had absolutely no running water. Now, when we went to the reception to inquire about this very obvious problem, we were told that the elephants had actually decided to try their hand at plumbing, and they had dug up all the pipes leading to the lodge. Now, I mentioned that Zambia's colonial history has been beautifully merged into its traditional and truly African culture, and this has produced something different and something that's extremely special. Many of the lodges we stay at are the perfect marriage between Zambia's rich history and they're somehow stuck in time in this oasis that's almost detached from the hustle and bustle of the rest of the modern world. And the lodge pictured in this image has to be one of my absolute favorite places I've stayed on any of the tours I've led since I've been working with Rock Jumper. And it's known as the Mama Out of Africa. Now, believe it or not, this lodge is actually built around the trailer that served as Meryl Streep and Robert Redford's dressing room during the filming of the beloved movie Out of Africa. Now, isn't that the most incredible way to start a tour to this country? This lodge is located right on the banks of the Zambezi River, with wild hippos serving as the nightly garden service. It truly is an absolute once-in-a-lifetime introduction into this incredible country. The lodging throughout the tours of a similar standard, always extremely comfortable, luxurious, lots of things to do, and the locations couldn't be any better if we had picked the sites ourselves. Truly some of the most picturesque spots anywhere in Africa. And finally, something that very few people can put into words is that perfect African sunset over the mighty Zambezi River. And this is simply a photographer's dream. But you might find yourself wondering, why was it that I chose such an underrated destination to speak to you about? Well, the banks of the Zambezi River were not only Livingstone's playground, but as Nikki said, this is also where my lifelong passion for birds was born. I grew up in a very small farming community in the extreme south of Zambia, very near Victoria Falls, under an hour's drive away. And I spent my weekends fishing the rich waters of the Zambezi. Now, much to my parents' dismay, and especially my brother, I never quite developed that level of patience that's required for fishing. And so to give them a moment's peace, I was handed my first bird book, given a pair of binoculars, and introduced to the fantastic hobby that is bird watching. Little did they know that in that moment they created something of a monster, and life for them has never quite been the same. Now, much to my surprise, my absolute wild childhood led into my career with rock jumper, and Zambia has now become something of a baby to me, and the birds I grew up seeing daily outside of my kitchen window have become some of the most sought after birds that we seek on our tour. I always, when I lead a tour to Zambia, I make an effort to visit the family farm, in that I know many territories of the rarer bird species that we're looking for. And while we're doing that, you are also absolutely guaranteed a very special outing with the very best bird guide in Zambia. And that is my furry child, Missy, who's pictured in this image. Now, she's admittedly far better than I am at finding fluff tails and crakes, but please no one mention that to her should you have the opportunity to meet her if you join us on a tour to Zambia. Now, to get back to business, to understand birding in Zambia, it's important to understand the local lingo. And there's three very important and unique habitats to consider when considering a birding trip to Zambia. And I'm sure none of these are words that you may have ever heard of. The first of these is Mushitu, which is swamp or gallery forest, often associated with the Dambo. Now, I haven't completely lost my mind, and I'm not simply making up words here. A Dambo is a seasonally waterlogged grassland, usually surrounded by Miombo woodland. And finally, Miombo woodland is dry woodland or forest dominated by two specific genera of trees. And I'll show you a few pictures of this in a moment's time, and this will make a lot more sense. Together, these three habitats define what we refer to as the Anglo-Zambesian region. And you'll note that more than 80% of the land area of Zambia is blanketed by these habitats at the very core of this biogeographic zone. This means that Zambia is the absolute #1 stop for anyone hoping to add these Anglo-Zambesian specials to their lists, with more than 90% of all of the premier targets found at just a few sites in the so often forgotten country. Now, that percentage far exceeds the percentage of these habitat-specific bird species that can be seen in any of the surrounding countries. The area is an extremely interesting one, and if I just talk you through the satellite image, it consists of a very unique mosaic of the three habitats. Miombo woodland, which you can see here as the darker green areas, is very characteristic of sandy soils on ridge tops, and these surround shallow depressions where water tends to accumulate. And the soils in these areas tend to be clay, implying that the water accumulates during the summer months and forms these incredibly wet dambos. These depressions ultimately form the tributaries of the Zambezi River, as the water that accumulates within them funnels to form shallow streams at their base. And it's along these streams that you get the small patches of Mushitu forest. To visually show this to you, Miombo woodland is a closed canopy woodland or forest, and it tends to have an extremely open understory. But what this means for us is bird watching this habitat is an absolute pleasure. We tend to wander around aimlessly through the woodland, not necessarily following paths, and the viewing conditions are always absolutely fantastic. We tend to follow bird calls as we rely on mixed species foraging flocks to find all of the specials, and this leads to moments of absolute mayhem where you just have birds all around you, surrounded by quieter lulls when bird activity is a little bit lower. But it's within these mixed species foraging flocks that we find the vast majority of the habitat-specific birds that we're after, implying that across all of the sites that we visit, we have an absolutely excellent chance of seeing all of the targets of the tour. After we finished in the Miombo woodland, we then tend to devote our time equally between the Dambos and the Mashitus for those habitat-specific birds. Now, the Dambos are incredibly thick, waist-high grasslands, and they become waterlogged in ankle-deep water during the summer months. And this is the time when they host some of Africa's absolute rarest and shyest birds, including no less than 5 of the 9 species of the world's flufftails, several absolutely impossible to see crake species, a number of rails, a number of snipes, some quails, some button quails. So although the chances aren't necessarily high to see all of these birds, we always add a couple to our list. And that's an absolute incredible adrenaline rush when you get to see one of these so very rarely seen bird species. And the final habitat is Mushitu, which is this evergreen gallery or swamp forest that typically forms at the very base of the Dambos. And this habitat hosts an incredible selection of very rare and little known Central African forest specials, most of which have a wider distribution through the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but which marginally extend into the northern parts of Africa, into the northern parts of Zambia. But enough of that. Let's get to what everyone really came for, and that's the birds. Now, Zambia has an incredible total of 780 species of bird that can be seen within its borders, but only 3 of these are endemic to Zambia, implying that only 3 can only be seen within the limits of Zambia. And this very low endemism rate is linked to the fact that the main habitats that you get in Zambia extend from Angola all the way through Zambia into neighboring Malawi and Tanzania. So many of the species are quite widespread through this distribution. But of the 138 habitat-specific species that are restricted to the 3 habitat types we've just discussed, more than 90% of them can be seen within Zambia, which, like I said before, far exceeds the percentage that can be seen in any of the other neighboring countries. Interestingly, Zambia has 42 BirdLife International recognized important bird areas with 8 sites of additional importance. Now, at 50 sites of avifaunal importance, this is one of the highest number of important bird areas of any country in Africa. But Zambia remains one of Africa's least explored countries in an ornithological sense. And within the last couple of years, there have been several recent ornithological discoveries within the country that are seriously boosting appeal for the country. Now, the most notable of these has been the discovery of the vermiculated fishing owl in extreme northwestern Zambia, which was a massive range extension for this very rarely seen species. Onto the birds themselves. Perhaps Zambia's most interesting endemic bird is the so-called white-chested tinkerbird. And that's the specimen you can see at the very bottom of this image, highlighted by the red arrow. Now, this bird was collected from the cryptocephalin forests in extreme northwestern Zambia in the year 1964. But despite numerous expeditions to the area, the bird has never been seen again. However, as recently as the year 2018, some scientists decided to study the specimen using genetic techniques, and their conclusion was that it ought to be downgraded as a species, in that they found it was more likely an aberrant yellow-rumped tinkerbird. So you will still read about the white-chested tinkerbird and some of the older references that you get for the country, but the white-chested tinkerbird, unfortunately, is no more. The next endemic is perhaps the species for which Zambia is most famous for, and that's the glistening white Chaplin's barbet. Now, this is a fascinating species, and it associates with sycamore figs, which you can see in this picture too. It's a true fig species. And interestingly enough, the birds have developed a mutualistic relationship with the fig trees. Each individual fig tree has its own fruiting season, implying that the barbets always have a fruit source and that the trees need not compete with one another when it comes to seed dispersal. So the easiest way to find this particular bird is just to find a fruiting sycamore fig, and the barbets will come to you. The final endemic is the black-cheeked lovebird, which is perhaps my favorite of the 3 endemics to Zambia. And this bird has recently been uplisted as an endemic to Zambia after extensive surveys in the neighboring countries of Botswana and Namibia failed to find the species. Now it's limited to an area of under 5,000 kilometers squared, making it one of the most localized parrot species in the world. And the reason for this is that they favor mature Mopani woodland with areas of permanent standing water, in that the birds are water dependent. So perhaps the easiest way to see this bird is to wait beside one such drinking spot near a stand of Mopani woodland, and the birds will come to you. But I mentioned that Zambia has an extremely low endemism rate, but the number of biome-restricted species found in Zambia is extremely high. Again, these are all of the Anglo-Zambezian endemics. Miombo woodland is a deciduous habitat, implying that the leaves are dropped during the winter months. And during spring and early summer, which is when we run all of our tours to the country, we get treated to an absolute visual spectacle where the forest turns into this incredible mosaic of color with the emergence of the new leaves. And this is simply a photographer's dream. Pictures simply cannot do this justice. It also means that during the spring and summer months, this is the prime time to visit in a birding sense, as this is when bird activity is generally at its peak. And some of the specials we hope to see in this habitat include the following. Now, no better species exemplifies the Miombo woodland endemics than this one, and this is the African spotted creeper. Now, this incredible little bird behaves something like a nuthatch in that it creeps up and down the larger trunks and branches in the woodland, picking insects from between the mosses and lichens that simply abound within the habitat. Its plumage perfectly matches the texture of the Brachystegia trees, which you can see in this photo, meaning that these birds can be exceptionally difficult to spot. However, they always give away their presence by their really, really cool, high-pitched sort of tinkling call. It's one of the most iconic sounds of the Miombo woodlands. One of our more glitz and glamour species in the woodland is the Anchieta's sunbird. And this bird is something of a taxonomic anomaly in that, together with the plain-backed sunbird, which you get in East Africa, it's somewhat taxonomically distinct from all other sunbird species. Unlike other sunbird species, the males and females are virtually identical in their plumage. They've got a far more complex song than many other sunbird species, and you tend to find them moving around in isolated pairs through the woodland. But it's always an absolutely spectacular bird to find. Another one of the very popular birds within the woodland is always the Arnott's chat, or the white-headed black chat. Now, this species favors the more mature and undisturbed stands of the Miombo woodland, in that it requires the very largest trees with suitable tree cavities in which it nests. But at a few sites that we now visit on our tour, these quirky birds have actually taken to nesting within the man-made constructed lodges, and there's a pair that nest within one of the dining rooms at one of the lodges that we stay at. So it's becoming increasingly easier to see this bird. One of my absolute favorite Miombo woodland endemics is this, the highly localized bar-winged weaver. Now, this bird can be a real challenge to find, but we do have a number of sites that are proving increasingly reliable for it. It's one of only a very few species of weaver that you get within Africa that have this incredibly unique behavior of creeping along branches, a bit like the spotted creepers do, and they behave something like a nuthatch for our Northern Hemisphere attendees tonight. but they associate with one particular lichen species known as usnea, or old man's beard. Now, if you can imagine an old man's long droopy beard, something you would see perhaps on an old wizard, that's exactly what this moss or this lichen looks like. And this particular weaver can only be seen within a specific microhabitat of the Miombo woodland where these lichens abound, as they not only rely on them for the specific foods that they eat, but also for breeding purposes, in that this is the only nesting material they use to construct their nests. Next up is the Sousa's shrike. Now, if you ask any guide that's worked in Zambia, they'll tell you that this is by far one of the more challenging species to catch up with. You tend to find them at the specific microhabitat once again, but for this species, it tends to be the ecotone or the intermediary habitat that you get between the mature Miombo woodland and Dambo. So at the very edge of the Dambo, you get these patches of stunted woodland, and that's the habitat of the Sousa's shrike. Now, unlike most other shrike species, they're incredibly reclusive and quite shy in nature. But once you find them, they tend to be quite confiding. And on one of my most recent trips to Zambia, we photographed this particular individual, and it came to within a meter or two of our group and was feeding absolutely happy, totally unperturbed by our presence. So a really, really nice bird to catch up with. Although not strictly a Miombo woodland endemic, the helmet shrikes, such as the Retz's helmet shrike pictured here, and the white crested helmet shrike, which is essentially a white equivalent of this bird, are an incredibly important component of the bird communities within Zambia. And we rely on them as they often form the core of the mixed species foraging flocks where we find the rest of our targets. One of the birds that tends to associate with these mixed species foraging flocks, it's almost always in attendance, is the white-breasted cuckoo shrike. Now, this is a female bird with a very poorly defined white breastband, but the male is absolutely spectacular with a very crisp, cleanly defined white breast and upper part of the chest, which perfectly contrasts with that beautiful lavender gray coloration. The next species is Miombo pied barbet. Now, this is one of our more challenging birds that we look for within the Miombo woodland habitats, and it's an extremely scarce species and one for which Zambia is without question the very best place to see the bird, although it is possible to see it in neighboring Angola and parts of Malawi too. This bird is then a personal favorite of mine, the racket-tailed roller, and I like to think that this is one of those birds that I specialize in showing people. Now, it's rather unique among the rollers in that it lives in small territorial parties throughout the year, but they're always a huge amount of fun to encounter. You typically find them sitting very quietly with a canopy of Miombo woodland. But as soon as you can get their attention, they perform this absolutely dramatic display where they'll fly a couple hundred meters up into the sky, close their wings, and just drop vertically back down into the woodland. So it's always a lot of fun to see this species. Another bird that's, although not strictly a Miombo woodland special, it's important to mention that during the summer months when we run our tours to Zambia, we have an absolute excellent chance at seeing this bird, which is one of Africa's most sought after species. It is, of course, the pennant-winged nightjar. Now, these totally outrageous males with the almost butterfly-shaped wings and these incredibly long, highly modified primary feathers typically can be seen performing their displays over grasslands in the early evening. And at this time of year, we often have the birds displaying right above our heads, which is really, really special. And saving the best for last, this bird is my absolute nemesis. It's the Shelly sunbird. It's an incredibly difficult bird to find throughout most of Zambia. Now, this incredible species moves around in association with flowering mistletoes, with which it associates, and it's usually seen up in the canopy of the Miombo woodland. The male, which is pictured here, is absolutely gorgeous, with this deep sooty belly, this broad red orange chest band, and then this metallic olive green upper parts. He's really quite spectacular. So it's important to note that these are just 10 of my personal favorite Miombo woodland endemics, and there's a number of other species that I haven't necessarily touched on, in that I need to look at some of the other habitats. But on that note, we're going to take a very quick break, and if Nikki will just load up our first poll for us, we'll see which of the three Zambian endemics people are most interested in seeing. So of the Zambian endemics, which of the following would you most likely, or would you most like to see? The white-chested tinkerbird, which I put ha-ha because it doesn't necessarily exist, the Chaplin's barbet, or the black-cheeked lovebird. And we'll just give a few moments for those results to come in. And it seems we almost have an equal percentage of black-cheeked lovebird, which takes out the win by just 1 vote, followed by the Chaplin's barbet. So carrying on with our presentation, we're then going to look at the Dambo habitats and some of the important birds that we'll be looking for there. Now, it's important to recognize that many of the bird species that we look for within Zambia's Dambo are seasonal visitors to the country. They typically arrive in about September and they depart in April for their European or North African wintering grounds. Some species do stay throughout the year, but they do tend to become a lot harder to see during the winter months. And the birds we'll be looking for in this habitat include the cuckoo finch, which is a really, really interesting bird, very characteristic of these seasonal habitats. And although fairly widespread in its distribution, I've seen it in a number of African countries, I've never actually seen such high numbers of the cuckoo finch anywhere else in Africa as I have in Zambia. At certain sites within Zambia, the trees literally become dotted by flocks of cuckoo finches, and the trees look something like a fully decorated Christmas tree. It's quite incredible to see. Now, it's a particularly fascinating bird in that it's recently been identified as a highly modified indigo bird, which is another very characteristic African group, in that it has the habit of laying its eggs within the nests of other birds, including cisticolas and premiers that share the same habitat. So it's a really, really interesting species. Keeping with the same yellow theme, the next bird we look for is the Fullerborn's longclaw, which is the Central African equivalent of the very much more widespread yellow-throated longclaw. And pairs of these birds can be seen quite regularly throughout Zambia's Dambos, together with 2 other longclaw species, the rosy-throated longclaw, which has a bright pink throat patch, as well as the highly localized Grimwood's longclaw, which can be seen in the extreme northwestern parts of Zambia. One of the more challenging bird species that we look for in this habitat is the absolutely minuscule locust finch. Now, at barely 10 centimeters, it's virtually impossible to spot these birds when they're sitting in the thick grass. But what tends to happen is as we walk through the grass, we flush them up and they disappear off into the distance as these little black and red bullets. But it's always a really nice bird to catch up with. As I said, many of Zambia's, the Dambo's top bird species use these habitats as their summer vacation spot, and several scarce seasonal visitors to this habitat include the globally threatened great snipe, the almost mythical striped crake, as well as the very delicately patterned spotted crake. But finally, Zambia is an absolutely fantastic spot to see large numbers of cranes. At a few sites, it's not uncommon to see flocks of several hundred grey-crowned cranes. As you can see in this picture, this is just a very small portion of a flock that we photographed in the country some time back. But importantly, Zambia is also the stronghold for the very stately wattled crane. With more than half of the world's wattled crane population occurring within wetlands in Zambia, including the single largest concentration of individual wattled cranes anywhere in the world, Zambia is without question one of the best places to catch up with the species. Obviously, we're also going to take some time to explore the Moshitu forest patches. And although many of the targets that we look for are quite widespread in their distribution, many of them aren't necessarily easily seen elsewhere, in that, as I said before, the majority of them have their core distribution running through the Congo, which obviously isn't the easiest place to visit. One of these species is the thick-billed cuckoo, a large and almost hawk-like cuckoo. And this bird parasitizes the Retz's helmet shrike, which means that it lays its eggs within the nests of the Retz's helmet shrikes. It's a fairly widespread species throughout Africa, but it's nowhere easy to see, although Zambia certainly ranks as one of the very, very best places to catch up with them. The gorgeous white-tailed blue flycatcher is another firm favorite of mine, and it's always a welcome treat when you're able to find these birds. It's a lot of fun in that they move around in these small and incredibly busy little flocks, and they have this regular habit of fanning their tails and then flicking them from side to side before moving from perch to perch. So a really fun bird to watch, and it's got a really unique pale dusty blue coloration. Another really quirky bird that's a regular feature at a few places in Zambia is the funky crested guinea fowl. Now, we typically nickname this bird the Bob Marley bird on our tours, given that it's got this really unique tuft of dreadlock-type feathers growing out of the top of its head. But it makes a really fantastic change from the much more widespread helmeted guinea fowl. And another personal favorite of mine is the absolutely outrageous red-throated twin spot. And you usually see this bird skulking in dense undergrowth at the very base of the Moshitu forest. And we use its extremely high-pitched calls that almost sound like a cricket to locate them. But typically, once you find a pair, you always see them in pairs, you tend to get some really, really nice looks at them. It's called a twin spot because on its breast feathers, on either side of the main shaft of the feather, you have just a single white spot on an otherwise black feather. Although not much of a looker by comparison, the extremely localized Laura's woodland warbler, which is in fact is part of the Phylloscopus group that have radiated so widely through Europe and Asia, is another one of these sought-after Anglo-Zambesian endemics that's best seen in Zambia. And keeping with the dull theme, the Anchieta's barbet is another very challenging one of these Anglo-Zambesian endemics. And this bird is notoriously difficult to come by. I've only seen it a handful of times. And although it doesn't compare much in terms of its plumage to the other African barbets, it's a really challenging bird to find. So when you find it, you feel this incredible sense of elation because it is such a rare and difficult species. Throwing a bit of color back into the mix, I believe that this bird, the black-bellied seedcracker, had a long and very personal vendetta against me in that it eluded me for the absolute longest time. But as always seems to be the case, once you see your first one, you begin seeing them everywhere. Now, this is another really, really fascinating bird in that it's polymorphic in its bill size, which means that certain individuals within the population have these tiny little bills, where others, such as the bird pictured in this incredible photo, might better be referred to as seed destroyers rather than seed crackers. With all that in mind, perhaps the two forest specials for which Zambia is best known are the barred long-tailed cuckoo, which is the summer visitor to Zambia, And this bird has a call like the distant siren of an ambulance, as well as the African pitta. Now considered by many to be the holy grail in African birding, the African pitta is just one of only 2 species that can be seen on the African continent. It's an exceptionally difficult bird to come by. I've only seen this bird a handful of times. Far more challenging than many of the Asian pitta species, given its nature that these birds only call for a brief 2-week period at the extreme start of the breeding season before they fall silent for the rest of the year. And that 2-week period is absolutely critical to finding them. Now, several years back, I had the immense pleasure of birding alongside Chris Goody, who some of you may know as the jewel hunter, for his efforts to see all of the world's pitta species within a single calendar year. As ambitious as his efforts may have seemed at the time, he succeeded, which was really incredible. But he described, of all the 42 species of pitta that he looked for, this was the absolute hardest of the lot. But eventually, he did find it in Zambia, and it was the final pitta that he saw within that calendar year. And since then, Zambia has gained fame as the very best place in the world to catch up with this incredible, incredible bird species. And it is now the firm focus of our restructured tour to the country. On that extreme high note, let's draw back to that mighty Zambezi River that we spoke of in the very beginning of the tour, as no trip through Zambia would be complete without at least some time spent exploring its waters. Central Africa is distinctly seasonal in its rainfall regime, with rainfall only falling between the months of September and April. But the Zambezi River provides a constant lifeline for the birds and other wildlife that you can see in Zambia. And so it's no surprise that several magical species can be found along its banks. The Bones beaters are yet another of the Anglo-Zambesian endemics, and this bird tends to favor the riverine woodlands that remain lush throughout the year on the very banks of the Zambezi River, as well as some of the other river systems within the country. And there's no question that this is one of Africa's most spectacular bee-eaters in these very rich olive green hues, as well as that beautiful cinnamon brown with the pale blue eyeliner below the eye. It's really quite something. Even better is perhaps the widespread southern carmine bee-eater that breeds a few isolated sites along the Zambezi, and we sometimes are lucky enough to see them at their breeding colonies, but it does tend to fluctuate in terms of the time of year according to water levels in the river. But this bird, we see it on every tour to the country. It's a really, really fantastic bird. Now, I have an email from a client who visited Zambia about 9 years ago, not on a rock jumper tour. She visited by herself, and she said she was so very looking forward to this presentation tonight because she said it would remind her of 2 of her major highlights from her visit to the country. And this is one of them, the absolutely spectacular Pell's fishing owl. Now, words cannot describe this bird. It's one of Africa's largest owl species. It's the largest owl in terms of its weight, and it's one of the most sought after bird species in the world. We usually see this bird roosting high up in an extremely dark tree. And I'll let you in on a little trade secret. The best way to find this bird is to scan for fish heads below the trees that they roost in that they're entirely pescatarian, as their name suggests. Though they can be notoriously difficult to find, we've got an excellent track record of seeing this bird on our tours to Zambia, and particularly on the Luangwa extension, which we run, where some of our local guides often know of the roost sites of the owls. 2 final targets that we look for on the rivers are the reclusive African finfoot, as well as the absolutely obscure African skimmer, which is one of only 3 species of skimmer that you get in the world. And these birds come to the Zambezi River en masse to nest on its sandbanks just prior to the arrival of the floodwaters from further north in Angola and the DRC. Now, although we don't strictly visit the site on our scheduled tours to the country, I'm going to just take this quick opportunity to note that the extensive Bangweulu Swamps in the very north of Zambia support one of the largest populations of shoebill anywhere in Africa. And we've run a number of tailor-made tours to the country where we've made use of this absolutely fantastic opportunity. And we've always seen this incredibly sought-after bird when we visited the site. Sharing the same habitat as well as some of the other wetlands we visit on the tour, the extremely localized slaty egret is also a regular bird in Zambia, and it's a very distinct possibility on our tours. There's very, very few places in the world that you can see a slaty egret. But on that note, if Nikki will then load up our second poll, we'll just take a short break. And this is more just a general knowledge opportunity to test everyone's knowledge. And the question here is, which African mammal undertakes the world's largest mammal migration? Is it the blue wildebeest, the African straw-colored fruit bat, or the plains zebra? So we'll just give a few moments for those results to come in. Unfortunately, for the answer to this question, you're going to have to wait towards the end of my presentation, and I will be showing you a few images of said migration, and I absolutely guarantee it will blow your mind. It's something unlike you have ever seen before. Perfect. So we have virtually an equal vote for wildebeest and the African straw-colored fruit bat, with the wildebeest taking the lead, but we will come back to that answer in a few moments' time. I mentioned earlier that Zambia also supports globally significant concentrations of several of Africa's absolute rarest and most threatened mammals. And perhaps my favorite of all of these is the extremely rare, shy, swamp-dwelling Sitatunga. Now, this bird lives entirely within the swamps. It's got this incredibly modified front hoof, which is splayed into a deep V like that. It's really quite incredible. It's exceptionally difficult to catch up with throughout its range, and to run the risk of sounding like a stuck record, Zambia is absolutely by far the very best place to see the species. I bet you I do sound like a stuck record. I've been lucky enough to encounter this animal in a few countries throughout Africa, and some of my best views have been in the Okavango Delta in the neighboring Botswana. But there's nothing quite like visiting Kasanka National Park in the north of Zambia and seeing up to 15, possibly even more, animals grazing out in totally open glades at any time of day. There's simply nowhere else in the world that you can see Sitatunga as well as you can in Zambia. Zambia also supports Africa's largest remaining population of the extremely rare and endangered roan and sable antelopes, including a very small isolated population of the almost extinct giant sable in the extreme northwest of the country. Other noteworthy creatures include a large and naturally migratory population of African elephants. I mentioned that all of the reserves in Zambia are totally unfenced. So as the water levels recede within the outer-lying pools, so the animals move back towards the rivers to get water during the dry season. But in the Luangwa Valley, where we run our extension that I'll tell you about in a few moments' time, there's also a unique subspecies of both the blue wildebeest, which is known as the Cookson's wildebeest, and this is the second creature that client who sent me an email referred to, the absolutely beautiful Thornycroft's giraffe. Now, Luangwa National Park was proclaimed to protect both the Thornycroft's giraffe, which you have to admit is perhaps one of the best giraffes in all of Africa, as well as the Cook's wildebeest in the 1970s. But it's since become one of Africa's absolute premier destinations in that it's one of the very best places to visit in terms of predator sightings. The shy serval is regularly sighted in Luangwa National Park, as well as a few other areas in Zambia. Spotted hyenas are common too, and importantly, totally wild and free-roaming populations of the hyenas still occur over very large areas of Zambia, and we regularly hear them at night around some of the lodges that we stay at. The Luangwa Valley also supports one of the largest single populations of African wild dogs of any national park in Africa, and this is one of the very best places to see these critically endangered animals. And finally, Luangwa National Park is second to none when it comes to leopard sightings, as the valley supports one of the highest densities of leopards anywhere in the world. Leopards are virtually guaranteed within the Luangwa Valley. The next slide is the answer to our second poll for the evening, and that is which animal species performs the world's largest mammal migration. And that, of course, is the African straw-colored fruit bat. Sorry, I see our third poll has just come up. Not a problem. Shall we quickly just answer this one? This is, again, just general knowledge. The Victoria Falls is traditionally known as the Mosi o Tunya. What do you think this translates to within the local language in Zambia? The smoke that thunders, the Great White Wall, or the Devil's Gorge? So we'll just give a few moments for that to come through. I am absolutely impressed. 93% of people think that the Mosi o Tunya translates to the smoke that thunders, and that is absolutely correct. Back to the bats. Now, one of Africa's very best kept secrets is the Kasanka bat migration, the single largest migration of any mammal species anywhere in the world. An estimated 10 million bats arrive to just a few acres of forest in this northern part of Zambia every year between the months of October and December, enticed by the promise of abundant fruit on which they feed. Now, the bats are extremely large with a wingspan of up to a meter, and it's estimated that these 10 million bats consume a mind-boggling 5,000 collective tons of ripe fruit each evening. How absolutely incredible is that? No one's really sure why the bats all flock to Kasanka in the way that they do. I mean, there are a lot of fruit trees there, but it seems ridiculous that 10 million bats arrive in just a tiny little patch of forest every year. But what's absolutely clear is that this is one of the greatest wildlife spectacles of any animal species in the world. We view the bats from carefully constructed platforms each evening as the bats leave the roost site to go and forage, and the sky literally becomes blackened by bat species. Just imagine the sight of 10 million bats leaving their roost site every evening. I'll say it again, it really is a wildlife spectacle like no other. And with the bats come one of Africa's second greatest assemblages of creatures, and that's the mass assemblage of birds of prey that arrive at the Kasanka forests, hoping to take advantage of the food bonanza. Seeing flocks of martial and crowned eagles, which are Africa's two largest eagle species, is not an uncommon sight at this time of year when bats reach their peak numbers. It's really, really incredible. But enough on the birds and the animals. What else does Zambia have to offer? Well, we've discussed the birds, the wildlife, but Victoria Falls is, of course, Zambia's major attraction. And we start every tour in the country with an afternoon visit to this incredible, incredible site. Seeing the sun set through the so-called Devil's Cataract at the very end of the falls is truly a life-changing experience. But I mentioned a few times that Zambia offers a safari experience like no other, and this deserves something more of an explanation. For starters, the lodges that we use throughout the country are set in absolutely prime locations, and the wildlife moves freely through these areas in a way that you don't see anywhere else in Africa. Encountering completely wild elephants en route to your safari tents, like you see in this image, or finding warthogs sleeping beside the fire pit in the main hall of the lodge on a cold evening, are not uncommon sights in the country. Though I will note that we take the absolute highest level of care to ensure everyone's safety, and that should absolutely not be seen as a deterrent when it comes to visiting Zambia. Similarly, having totally placid elephants and other big game come within touching distance is a regular feature of an open-back safari experience within Zambia, and it really allows one to appreciate the sheer magnificence of these incredible creatures. But on our standard tour, we also take the opportunity to explore some of Zambia's top wildlife areas by boat, and we enjoy literally thousands of hippos wallowing in the river, as well as fantastic views of elephants and other big game coming to the water's edge to drink. And for the photographers who may be watching, this affords us the absolute fantastic opportunity to get really nice up close and personal views of the birds and the wildlife, which makes for an incredibly memorable experience. In saying all of that, Zambia is perhaps most famous for its walking safari, being one of the only countries in Africa to offer walking safaris as part of the standard activity packages that you can do. Not only does this allow you the opportunity to interact with game on foot, such as this group that are enjoying some time with a white rhino, but it also gives you one of the most intimate safari experiences imaginable. It allows you to take in the sights, the tracks, the sounds that you so often miss on those standard safari experiences. And it really does add a new dimension to a safari. It doesn't involve any tremendous amount of walking to do these sorts of safaris. You drive to the prime location and you walk out from there. It really makes for an enjoyable experience. So what tours do we at Rock Jumper offer to Zambia? Well, the first is a fairly highly specialized tour. This will be running next in February of next year. And it's an 8-day tour that includes time in both Zimbabwe and in Zambia. And it targets some of Africa's least recorded and least known bird species, including those crakes, the rails, the flufftails that we so often don't have time to look for. Now, it was an incredibly ambitious effort to run this tour for the first time that we did it, but it's proved highly successful in the past. I personally guided the tour last year, and on the 11 days that we had within the country, including the Endemics extension, we managed to see an incredible list of birds, including most of the Miombo woodland endemics, 4 out of the 5 flufftail species we intended on finding, and some absolutely mythical bird species, including the striped crake. Now, for your more everyday birder, we do offer a Miombo and summer tour, which will be running next year in December. And this is our recently restructured tour that includes almost equal times bird watching and game viewing. We'll target all of the key birds to the area. We typically get a list of easily over 350 birds, often quite close to 400 bird species, as well as an absolutely fantastic list of mammals to boot. And if you have the time, of course, on top of that tour, we run the South Luangwa extension, where we go down into the Luangwa Valley. And this is just a safari experience like no other. So I'm going to give you a brief rundown of this Miombo and summer tour, so you have a little bit more information on it. We start the tour in Victoria Falls, and on the very first day of the tour, we visit the absolutely incredible Victoria Falls. From there, we drive up to a small town called Choma, which is actually where I grew up. And we're going to be working basically my parents' backyard to find the incredibly sought after Chaplin's barbet. En route, we'll go through a patch of habitat where we'll stop to look for the black-cheeked lovebird to ensure that we get 2 of the endemics to the country. We then spend a couple of days right on the banks of the absolutely fantastic Lake Kariba. And this is where we're going to be looking for a number of really, really scarce and difficult bird species, including the African Pitta. And from there, we start working our way up into the very north of the country, where we'll be working the Miombo woodlands for all of the Anglo-Zambezi specials. And we stop en route just for an overnight stay, but our final destination is perhaps the premier birding site in all of Zambia. And this is where we find virtually all of the Miombo woodland endemics within just 4 days. As we make our way back to Lusaka, we stop past the Kasanka bats, which should be in full force at this time of year. And here we'll also have the opportunity to explore some of the rich Dambos in the area, as well as the fabulous Mushitu forest during the day. And then each evening we'll go and watch the bats. And finally, we end the main tour in Lusaka before continuing on the extension into the Luangwa Valley. And finally, the Luangwa extension ends back in Lusaka. It's important to note that to get to and from the Luangwa Valley, we will be taking an internal charter flight, but it's an incredibly smooth and comfortable ride. And on that note, I think it's time that I stop talking, but there's no better way to end this talk than perhaps with that Zambian traditional end-of-day sundowner cocktail and the absolutely picturesque and perfect African sunset. And I hope very soon as it's safe to do so again, that I get the opportunity to share my little perfect piece of paradise with some of you that are watching today. So that's all from me. Keith, I think, is going to handle the questions and answers. I'm here to answer them. So, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic, Daniel. Yeah, mind-blowing. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to have traveled a few times to Africa, but to Zambia, should I say, but that was a real trip down memory lane. Some wonderful images and really showcased the country in all its glory. We've had some interesting questions. So yeah, folks, if you would like to stay online and hear some of the answers during the Q&A, you're more than welcome to. We'll probably be another 15 minutes or so with the question and answers. Thanks, Daniel. So yeah, to kick things off, a few of them that come through you have dealt with, because some of them came through quite earlier. But Jules is asking, can you speak to the temperatures and humidity at the various sites during the tour? She's not so fond of the heat and humidity. Fair enough. So yeah, you can just give a little more detail on that front.
So the temperatures tend to be, daytime temperatures tend to be extremely comfortable throughout much of the country. There are a number of sites that we do visit that do have slightly higher humidity. I mentioned that on the main tour, we go down to the banks of Lake Kariba to look for pittas and other things. Down there, it can be really hot during the day, but we do time our birding activities accordingly, that we're not out during the hottest parts of the day. We work the cooler parts of the day in the early morning and late afternoon. So heat and humidity should absolutely not be seen as a deterrent anyway. It really is quite comfortable in Zambia.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I guess the one area where you get a bit of more humidity is the Zambezi Valley, as you say, in December when looking for African pittas. But yeah, for that bird, you're willing to put up with a little humidity for that one.
Absolutely. And to find that bird, you also require a fairly early morning. So it's nice and cool when we're walking looking for that bird.
Yeah, yeah, very true. Just to follow on that as well, are the tours during the rainy season, Dan?
Yes, so given that bird activity tends to peak during the rainy period, we do visit during the rainy period, but the nature of the rains within Zambia, it's typically a late afternoon shower, so you'll get a big thunderstorm moving in, so rain isn't it doesn't become a nuisance in any way.
Excellent. And I think just to touch on for folks, there's quite a few first questions coming through about that timing for the African Pitta. What is sort of the best time for the African Pitta? Do we target that bird on the tours? And just to tie in with that as well, the main tour is in December, but in the presentation it seemed that October was a better time for some birds. Maybe you can just go into a little more detail on that front.
The peak of activity in terms of Zambia's birds in general runs from September, when birds tend to start gearing up to breeding, all the way through to April at the end of the breeding season. Now, in order to have our best chances of seeing the African Pitta, we run our main tour, the Miombo and Summer Tour, during the first 2 weeks of December. And history has shown that this is the very best time to see the bird within the Zambezi Valley. So the entire tour is structured around seeing the African Pitta. In terms of seeing the Miombo woodland endemics, activity does spike during the summer months, but generally at any time of year, most of them can be found. But we do want the migrants to be there, so any time between September and April is good. But that first 2 weeks of December is absolutely critical to see an African Pitta. And we have excellent chances of seeing the Pitta.
Yeah.
It is hit or miss, but we've excellent chances. There's no better place than the Zambezi Valley.
Yeah, agree with that 100%. Just to tie in with that as well, does the summer tour include pennant-winged nightjar in breeding plumage?
Absolutely, it does. So the pennant-winged nightjars tend to display from early through to midsummer. So we have an excellent chance at finding the birds doing their displays. I've seen them displaying as late as mid to late December. So extremely good chance of seeing the males in full breeding plumage, and very good chance of seeing the displays as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Dan. And yeah, just a lot of great words coming through as well with your presentation. Marsha saying another excellent presentation. Daniel, thank you. Sandy saying as well, fantastic webinar, Dan. Perfect mix of really interesting information and lovely photographs. Time for a visit to Zambia. So yeah, you've certainly got some people thinking about the country, which is great because, as you started off saying, it's a very underrated destination. So Bob's just asking here, what bird guides would you recommend? So field guides.
It's been a bit of a problem for Zambia in that it's an awkward in-between between East Africa, where there are various different guides to choose from, as well as Southern Africa, where again we have many different guides that we can choose from. So the very best bird guide for Zambia is unfortunately the Birds of Africa South of the Sahara. It's the most comprehensive physical book that you can get for the country. However, very recently we have some friends of mine actually have published an app on the birds of Zambia. And this includes, it was published earlier this year, it includes the most up-to-date information in terms of distribution. It's got illustrations, photos, recordings of the songs of all the birds in Zambia. So it's an absolutely invaluable resource when visiting the country.
Yeah, I agree with that. I've actually got that app as well with Santa's. It's very good. Very, very good.
Yeah, no, fantastic.
They've done a great job. So yeah, a few more questions as well. Obviously, African Pitta, a big bird. But another big one that you mentioned, which is a highly prized African species, is shoebill. And quite a few folks are asking about shoebill. And obviously that's a species that's not targeted during that summer trip. And people are sort of asking, it sounds like seeing the shoebill is a special trip, something that you'd need to do as a separate trip. Maybe you could just give a little bit more of a round off of how you could go potentially about doing that. And as you said, we've done it before a number of times on private tours. But what would be a nice way to sort of potentially tie that in if they were to come out for the summer trip as well?
Absolutely. So the shoebill has on occasion been seen at Kasanka National Park, which is a site that we do visit on our tour. Unfortunately, it is extremely rare there. So the furthest thing from guaranteed, it's more extreme luck. You may come across one. In order to see Shoebill in Zambia, one needs to go into the Bangweulu Swamps. It is possible to charter a flight from Lusaka into the Bangweulu, which is how we've typically done our tailor-made tours to Bangweulu in the past. It is possible to drive in, but it's only possible to drive in during the winter months, during the dry season when the floodwaters recede. And that's the best time to see the shoebill, in that the shoebill get concentrated in a smaller area of water. So to see shoebill in Zambia, one does have to go in the winter months when we don't typically run the tours, but it is quite easy to get there. There are lots of camps to stay at in the Bangweulu area. Most of them are pop-up camps, so they only come up in the winter months when it's actually possible to access the swamps. But once you get to Bangweulu, it's relatively straightforward to see the shoebill. And it's quite easy to tie Bangweulu in with some of the other sites nearby. Kasanka is very close by. Mutanondo, which is Zambia's absolute premier birding destination, is basically across the road. So there's lots to do in the area. So it can easily make a fantastic tailor-made tour.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think also the winter months really, it's a fantastic time of the year for game viewing as well. So you sort of can tie in really nicely shoebill with the big game. And as you mentioned before, the Miombo birding is fantastic when you can get into the mixed flocks and what have you. And those winter months are the time when those mixed flocks are moving about in a big way. So you can really tie them quite nicely together. Yeah.
And many of the Miombo woodland birds, as I said, they can be seen throughout the year. So although summer is typically the best time to see them, they're there throughout the year. So quite straightforward to catch up with. It would also be worth just mentioning that Bangweulu has an endemic animal, the black lechui. It's a subspecies of the lechui. And you get these immense herds of lechui out on the flats that surround the Bangweulu. So it's another real highlight and a real target when you go into that area.
Yeah, absolutely. I have very fun memories of actually waking up on the banks in Bangweulu Swamps, surrounded by black lechui, just around the camp. Incredible.
Yeah.
And then I think we had about a flock, about 250 wattle cranes coming through as well.
Yeah.
Morning at Bangweulu. It's pretty phenomenal. What's the chances of seeing Tighter falcon at Vic Falls? Should we say
it depends who you ask, is perhaps the easiest way to answer that. Tighter falcon used to breed in one of the gorges below Victoria Falls. Unfortunately, and we think it's for several reasons. First of all, peregrine falcons moved into that gorge system, and we think they chased the tighter falcons out. Secondly, with all the air traffic, the helicopters and microlights that fly over Victoria Falls, we think that disturbed the falcons, so they aren't seen there anymore. There are a number of reports occasionally that someone claims to have seen it, but I'll wait to see some photographic evidence there. But unfortunately, tighter falcons become exceptionally difficult in Zambia.
Yeah. That is dead true. So a few just general questions. What's the transportation like? The roads, are there long drives? And what about internal flights?
So there are a number of lengthy drives on the tour. Perhaps our longest drive will be about 6 hours, but all of that is on very comfortable paved roads in a very comfortable vehicle. The distance is great, but it's a very easy travel between the destinations. As for internal flights, we do take an internal flight from Lusaka when we go up into the Luangwa Valley on our South Luangwa extension. It is also possible to fly between some of the major cities within Zambia, so to fly directly from Lusaka to Livingstone if someone wanted to perhaps do the tour, but then spend a bit of time in Livingstone at the end or something like that. It's very, very easy to move around through Zambia.
Wonderful, Dan. Chances, again, I know you didn't mention it briefly, but chances of finding wild dogs and getting to watch them interact. Also, do they sometimes know where there's any dens for wild dogs?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So South Luangwa is one of the very, very best places to see African wild dogs. The guides within the reserve typically know the whereabouts of the packs at any one point. Some of the animals are collared, so they can or they do monitor their movements. So we know where all the dens are. I hesitate to say it's guaranteed chance. The inner guide in me hates using that word, but it's almost guaranteed to see wild dogs in South Luangwa.
Yeah, agree 100% again. And then, yeah, just to finish off with, I guess, well, let's go. Yeah, there's one more here, just about species. How many species do we typically see on the rock jumper trip? I know you did mention it briefly during the presentation, but
so on our standard tour, the Miombo and summer tour, anything between about 350 and 400 birds is quite easily attainable. Many of the birds, like I mentioned, we give ourselves ample opportunity to find them, and so you do get a very healthy list of bird species. We typically see all the major targets, so it's a very, very easy birding destination. It's extremely high reward for our efforts.
Excellent, Dan. And then one more, just to end on a personal note. How many species have you seen in Zambia? And what is your most wanted species in the country?
That's a difficult one. I've probably seen, I would think, over 600 species in the country, considering the country list is close to 800 now. At a guess, I would say probably over 600. In terms of my most wanted bird, I find it very difficult, though I've seen the bird species hundreds of times before, I find it very difficult to look past that red-throated twin spot that I showed you a picture of. It's always a firm favorite of mine. It's one of those absolutely incredible birds. And a bird that's incredibly close to home for me, literally, is the racket-tailed roller, which I mentioned. It's one of the birds I like to think I specialize in showing people. It's a bird I grew up with, so it's a firm favorite.
Great, Dan. Sorry, one more has just come in over here. I think we'll just quickly take this last one, Nikki. How physically demanding is the main trip?
Very easy. There are no uphill or downhill trails that we have to walk. Like I say, like I said in the presentation, we do tend to wander aimlessly through the woodland, just simply following bird calls. So it tends to be extremely easy, no long distance walking. In terms of the time that we spend in the Dambos, that can, as we try to flush crakes and rails and things, that can be a little bit more physically demanding, but we tend to those who aren't necessarily up to walking back and forth through the grass, we can very easily accommodate that, and it's not a problem. You can stand on the outside and watch for birds as they flush up. It's really not a problem. It's not a physically demanding trip whatsoever.
Fantastic, Dan. Yeah, thanks so much. We've had so many lovely comments coming through. I could spend the next 10 minutes reading through all of those, but I'll hand over to Nikki now and let you all go. Thanks so much, Dan.
I echo that. Thank you to all the lovely comments, and thank you, Dan. And join us next week for an intimate virtual exploration across the roof of Africa with Nigel Redman, one of the world's most knowledgeable tour leaders and co-author of the superb field guide, The Birds of the Horn of Africa. With an exceptional volume of endemic birds and wildlife, Ethiopia has always ranked as one of the top destinations to visit on the African continent. The roof of Africa, as it is often referred to, is also blessed with a remarkable history and some of the most extraordinary cultures on the planet. We invite you to come and learn more about the remote Omo Valley, where untouched local tribes still forage an existence in this harsh terrain, which is the last stronghold of the beautiful Ethiopian wolf and a plethora of endemic birds to boot. These webinars are offered for free, but if you would like to donate to our guides, we have set up a GoFundMe account where all the funds go towards our guides while they're unable to work due to the travel restrictions and lockdown. From all of us, from the Rock Jumper team, we hope to see you next week. Goodbye, and thank you for joining us. Cheers, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.